First of all, I would like to thank you, Turkish IR Society, for engaging BMI Mellon for this very important topic. As a 237 years old institution, we have few pillars to continue to our life cycle, being relevant to the markets. One is the technology. A second one, I think another important factor is the sustainability of our presence and of our businesses, counterparts. So this is one of the areas that therefore we give a lot of importance. For this occasion, we pick up a panel titled Sustainable Debt Products, Green, Blue, Social, and Beyond. And in this panel, we would like to discuss certain topics, major topics like market trends, product labeling challenges, bridging the data needs of issuers and investors, like setting the different angles, capital markets responses, and how to solve the market challenges, which is still lots of challenges involved. For this, let me introduce myself. My name is Cihat Takunyacı. I'm heading BMI Mellon Istanbul Rep Office as the chief representative. For 24 years, I'm working for BMI Mellon. We lined up very experienced fellow panelists from different locations of BMI Mellon. I would like to introduce one by one. The first colleague is Adriana Pierelli, who is Managing Director of Global Client Management Organization of our bank. She's based in Milan. Over 30 years of experience in the financial industry, Adriana is head of Southern Europe and has responsibility of several key clients, including global systematic important FIs and central banks. And among her responsibilities, she's also a member of BMI Mellon's Global ESG Steering Council and our ESG Client Solutions Working Group, and responsible for ESG at our European Bank overall. Second panelist, Aish Maurya, our ESG digital and data principal in issuer services of BMI Mellon organization. A data analytics native who has gone green and currently exploring ways on how technology, data science, and digital together can help create innovative financial industry solutions, helping issuers adhere to second-degree scenario. Aish's current focus is building corporate trust strategic capabilities in sustainability bond segment. He joined BMI Mellon in 2014 as part of specialty analytics team and hold master's science in quantitative finance from Smurfit School of Business, University College Dublin. My third colleague, Corinne Neal, she is Global Head of Business Applications. By the way, Aish is located in our Dublin, Ireland office. Corinne Neal, based in London, Global Head of Business Applications at BMI Mellon. She's going to represent the investor side of the story for today. Global Head of Business Application at BMI Mellon Data Analytics Solutions, which is the fintech arm of our bank. BMI Mellon recently launched an ESG application targeted at investors, which has won Best Innovation of the Year in Artificial Intelligence category by Voters Technology and Best Innovation by Global Investors. And my last panelist, Paloma Alvarez Uria, she's based in Madrid, Spain. She's Senior Relationship Manager on Corporate Trust EMEA organization, covering relationship with financial institutions and corporates for the Iberian region out of our Madrid branch. For the past year, she has been leading the ESG conversation with the DCM community in EMEA, listening to issues and arrangers' concerns, priorities in the issuance of ESG bonds, where BMI Mellon is acting as trustee, issuing and paying agent. And she has experience with the company for over 20 years in different positions. Without further ado, I would like to immediately quick the importance of actually the sustainability and especially environment side of the story. As you know, in Turkey, we are experiencing for the last couple of months a heavy sea snow in Marmara Sea, which actually technically affects almost 2/3 of the population because of the proximity and 40% of the industry located. And that also shows how important and environmental driven factors and shows us the importance of to find quicker solution and being responsive on such issues, especially to manage the biodiversity of the region. So such an important effect need to tackle important the actions. But before, I think in order to tackle the issues, I think we need to define the marketplace. And I would like to start with Adriana and asking BNY Mellon position in the ESG space and market trends that she's exposed to see through her connectivity. Adriana, please help us to proceed.
About why we're here. We are very much a platform provider, helping our clients succeed in the investment kind of cycle and their activities. And we have a unique model that allows us to position ourselves as a central orchestrator, helping our clients in the global capital markets. And just to give a couple of numbers which may help, we have 41 trillion assets under custody, which really represent 20% of all the assets in the world. They're in custody with us. And also, if I'm looking at this from a data perspective, because I think this is becoming more and more important, and in this subject that we're discussing today, it's even more important. We have over 30 trillion in assets where we're really looking at the data component of those assets, and we're leveraging the data to provide our clients with insight and information that's really helpful to them for their business model. In the issuer space that we're also going to look at, we're a #1 provider in the DR space, in the deposit receipt space for those entities and those companies that want to be positioned in the US market with their own equity. But also on the debt capital markets, we are one of the largest providers in the world. And of those assets we currently help administering, 38 billion are green bonds. And I think that's another key element of our discussion today, is also helping people to understand that angle. Finally, we're also a large investment management provider. We're not going to discuss that specifically, but we have a good view of the investor needs, both from our own boutiques perspective, as well as a provider to asset managers in the world. And there we're the 7th largest asset management provider, and 75% of the assets we manage are managed by our boutiques, who are also PRI signatories. Again, just to put a little bit of the context of why we're discussing. And finally, last thing that I would say, more and more we're also fintech. We're investing 3 billion every year in our technology. Majority of this is now invested in innovation, which is a key element for the future of the financial industry, we believe. Why is this becoming? It has become, I would say, the key element, or one of the key elements at the level of the CEOs and the first line of every single financial institution in the world and every single asset manager in the world. And there are 3 main reasons. One is there are in a number of markets at this point, both in Europe, in some of the countries in Asia, but also in the US, enhanced regulations and disclosure requirements in the space. The second one, there are massive government investment plans in Europe for sure, but also now in the US, what Biden has announced is becoming a critical element in terms of the investment opportunities in ESG, in climate specifically. And there are increasing pressures from the investors and really the people in the street, right? Every one of us are concerned with the climate change and focusing on making the change or pressurizing our government and all the people we do any business with to actually help on the climate change perspective. In terms of some numbers also here, again, just to kind of put things in context, global assets that are applying ESG data have more than tripled over 8 years. Now, these numbers may be slightly different depending on the source, but we're talking about around 41 trillion in 2020, which is a huge number, of course. According to Morningstar, in first quarter 2021, there has already been a 19% increase in sustainable investment funds to nearly 2 trillion. And in 2019, so last year, 1 year before, European domiciles ESG funds grew 56%. And they are now 668 billion. Now, a lot of that may be change of a nomenclature from normal fund to an ESG or sustainable fund. So there is a lot of that going on, but still it tells the level of change in the marketplace going to more of an ESG kind of agenda. On the issuer side, in terms of green bond issuances, in 2019, there was already a peak with 257 billion, notwithstanding COVID and the fact that there was less issuance in the market. 2020 was a better year for issuances, and we reached 270 billion. All in all, we surpassed the 1 trillion. Again, the numbers are massive in a very short period of time, if you think about that. And finally, sustainable bond issuances are expected to reach 650 billion only in 2021. So this is accelerating. It's not only has grown a lot, but it's accelerating. Now, just moving for a second to regulations, how much has the regulatory landscape changed, right? So it started all in 2015. So again, not such a long time ago, with the UN Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030. There were 7 sustainable development goals decided upon, with only one related to climate change mitigation and 169 targets. Same year, the Paris Agreement was signed. It was signed by 197 countries, 191 ratified the agreement, and interestingly, the US exited and re-entered the agreement only a few months ago. And of course, there the focus was to allow for increase in temperatures of not more than 2 centigrades, relative to pre-industrial levels, which is a huge target to achieve and a very difficult one to achieve if we don't go there all together in the shortest possible time frame, to be fair, acting now. And then we go to March 2018, where the European Commission Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth was actually approved in only 18 months. The EU was never able to do anything like that in that time frame. Normally it was 24 or 36 months for any legislation of this nature. The reason why it was done in such a short time frame, and this was kind of an interesting conversation with one of the commissioners who was at the table, was the Greta effect. So the fact that Greta was explaining and talking to the kids and to the young, people in the world about climate change and how that climate change was affecting all of us, and no one was listening, actually really pressurized the agenda and made it possible to decide, such a huge plan in a very short time frame. And there, again, we're entering capital flows towards a more sustainable economy, mainstreaming sustainability in risk management, so introducing in every risk management approach also climate, and fostering transparency and a long-term approach. All of a sudden, financial institutions are asked to have a scenario that is 30 years out, 20 years out. We've never done this before. So a whole scenario planning with a complete different time frame in mind when you're looking at climate. More recent, December 2019, of course, the European Commission Green Deal, with huge amounts of money associated with that. 2021, Biden, the new administration approved, to re-enter the Paris Accord, and the climate agenda is one of the probably the few agendas that is at the same table of the US and China, who are leading the chart on this topic. And of course, if we're looking at the future, this is it's not a project that's finishing with climate, but certainly from a European standpoint, the expansion is there to go to brown taxonomy, biodiversity, social taxonomy. So, there is already a plan for the next couple of years to introduce and implement more of the ESG agenda, expanding from climate, which I think it's a key element of discussion. What does it mean for investors? Just very briefly, and I know that Corinne and Aisha and Paloma are going to go into more details about that, but there is a huge pressure from the civil society, as we were saying before, for institutional investors to be able to provide those products that have an ESG label associated to it, which means they do what I care about. There is a regulatory expectations that managers introduce, climate in the risk management agenda at all levels, but also the governance is there where the boards are liable, are responsible for making sure that climate is on the agenda and it's dealt appropriately. So this is not any longer something with a nice, climate or ESG working group somewhere down in the company, but it's very much at the top of those companies, which it has been a meaningful change, which is very visible in all our clients. And clearly there's on the other side, an increased need for green assets to invest into. Do investors, are they able to find the types of securities, both green bonds and other assets that would actually meet their needs? And it's not a given that they are there to be found. From an issuer perspective, of course, the governments, right? So governments are issuing more and more on the green bonds. We've seen a number of countries that are going in the space with huge amounts, and of course with purpose, which is a key element. And if I'm thinking about what numbers are we talking about, the EU has positioned a plan that's talking about over 2 trillion in assets, 800 billion, and so it's climate related. The Biden administration has talked about a 2.1 trillion, project, which is now being reduced somewhat to 1.75. It hasn't been approved yet, but a lot of what they're talking about is changing the infrastructure to be more in line with the needs of, a climate agenda. So really kind of changing everything that's related to car, automotive. It's quite wide. And of course, we're going to corporates and SMEs, which also need to issue green bonds. And, large corporates are certainly better placed to do that than SMEs, but we'll discuss this further. In terms of the largest markets, of course, it's, in 2020, we're talking the US and then Europe, Germany, France, and fourth, interesting enough, China. Key issues, and then I'll certainly end on this note. I mean, there are a number of issues, both for investors and issuers. And if I'm thinking about some of the issues that investors have, lack of specialized resources. Is there the knowledge? Are there enough people with knowledge of the subject at the right level of detail to be able to operate? Lack of clarity of what ESG investing even really means, which again is an interesting point. Keeping pace with the regulatory changes. There's huge amount of change coming through, and some of that is not completely clear, or the data points, and we're going more into the data discussion later on. Are there the data to be used in order to be able to comply or to ensure that your products are what they should be? Fear of negative impacts on financial performance. So is this kind of a end or is an end, right? Am I going to be able to have performance as well as being able to deliver on the climate agenda, or this is not possible? Fear of being accused of greenwashing and information asymmetry. This is true for both investors and issuers. And on the issuer side, I will just kind of say, there is also a little bit of a problem with lack of understanding where there is a price advantage for an issuer while issuing green bond versus a non-green bond. But the rest is really very much related also to the size of the issuers. Are they able to comply with the taxonomy that's extremely complex? And are they able to handle all of that information, particularly at the time of the first issuance, versus when it's a repeat issuance? So I'm not going to take away further time from my colleagues, but just to set the scene and hopefully to have a further interesting discussion around these topics.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you very much for setting this scene. Now I would like to turn to Paloma. Why we see this the infrastructure, but how this changes affected in the debt capital markets? What's the impact of this agenda? What kind of changes we're already seeing, or what and we're gonna see in the future? Paloma, can you help us?
Sure. So I mean, Adriana has already told us the impact is huge. We have seen a large increase in the issuance of green bonds since 2015. There has been a cumulative annual growth of around 60%. And some reports published by rating agencies such as Moody's, they expect the sustainable bond issuance in 2021 to be up to 650 billion. I mean, this will represent an increase over 32% over 2020. So this year it's expected that 8 to 10% of the total global bond issuance will be green, which is a huge change from the previous years. I mean, the market understands that there is an increase in the ESG awareness, which has been identified, intensified with the current pandemic. It is clear that it's in the agenda of the issuers, of the investors, consumers. Like we said previously, everyone is talking about ESG. It is in the conversations that people are having in the day-to-day. People are even consuming ecological goods, food, and so it is key. I mean, all this entire ecosystem is all interconnected. So what we see that asset managers and investors are demanding a more clear transparency to the issuers, which is in turn is driving the global, policy. In terms of Europe, we have seen how the European Green Bond standards pretend to help towards, more transparency and harmonize reporting. And I think, like we mentioned earlier, 50% of the bonds global issues are originated in the European Union. So I think with all these market developments, I think that the issuers have a very good understanding what other their obligations will be and how they will be driving the ESG agenda in the capital markets. Another effect that we've seen, and one of the changes for this ESG becoming a priority, is we have seen the evolution of interaction between the investors and the issuers' investors relations department. Bondholders typically felt that their influence over the company's obligation was kind of very limited to bond roadshows and the covenants of the bond. But now they're realizing they can exert influence over the company's investment, the risk management practices, issues disclosure, which directly, drive the ESG agenda. So I think, the green bonds in this regard represent, a considerable innovation because they focus on the green use of proceeds, the impact reporting, external review. So I think they have provided to bondholders a degree of transparency, and also they realize that they can become more involved in the strategy of the company, which was like an area which was previously only directed to equity investors. And we have seen that now bond investors have become, they have more power in the debt capital markets.
Thank you very much, Paloma. Now we'd like to turn to Corinne, taking to the investor side of the story. As Paloma summarized, there is always a question mark. Is there really interest, or is it a passion? How you see on the investor side? Is it growing as fast as it is? Is it good, or what's the challenges that hindering that progress? How you see it?
So I would like to comment on what Adriana just said a few minutes ago on the growth that we observe. So one of the applications that we deployed on the public cloud to help our clients is focused on understanding the behavior of US retail investors. And what we do observe since the beginning of this year is very rapid growth in their demand and their subscriptions into investment products that are labeled as sustainable by Morningstar. But it is really important to realize a few things. First of all, is that although this is the category that is growing the fastest among US retail investors in particular, this is also quite small comparatively to the rest of the investment products that is available for them to invest into. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that even for the US retail investors, those products that they invest into have been safe self-labeled as sustainable by the manufacturers of those products, which are asset managers. And I think that what we are starting to see in the data that we process, because we produce projected demand for those investment products, what we're beginning to see is actually retail investors being more inquisitive as to what they invest into and querying what are the features that makes those products sustainable. So there might be changes going forward. So bear in mind on the retail segments part of the market, especially in the US, fast growth, much faster than any other types of investments, but still relatively small compared to the overall size of the market, and potentially changes because of the self-labeling being challenged. What do we see on the institutional investment side? So as you just said, we introduced that application, ESG Data Analytics, that has been available to everyone to try and to buy since the beginning of the year. And this application applies globally to all institutional investors. And we developed this application because all of our surveys with institutional investors and that of our client and that of third parties such as the CFA Institute show that between 40 to 50% of institutional investors are staying on the sideline of investing into sustainable products. Why are they staying on the sideline? That's a huge amount of capital that is not deployed towards sustainable goals. When we ask our institutional investor clients, they basically say that there are three main areas that are preventing them or that are creating hurdles for them to invest in sustainable investments. First of all, they have themselves individual set of sustainable priorities. There is no such thing as a unique definition of sustainability. What it is to you will be very different to what it is for me. And as a result of that, they want to make sure that when they invest into something labeled as sustainable, it meets their own set of definition of priorities. And that's really important because Adriana mentioned the term mislabeling or greenwashing or social washing, which is when a product has been mislabeled with a definition of sustainability that does not correspond to the definition that the investor understands as being sustainable. And that's absolutely critical because in all of our surveys, different investors around the world have very different priorities. Some of those are quite regional, actually. When we speak to institutional investors in Asia Pacific, for instance, they tend to emphasize aspects of, for instance, access to clean water or financial inclusion. When we speak to institutional investors in North America, they tend to focus on issues of social equity and diversity and inclusion. And a little bit of climate action as well. When we speak to institutional investors in EMEA, it's very much about climate action, partly because of the push from regulators. So even regionally, institutional investors have very different priorities. So challenge number one is different definition of sustainability that has to be addressed. Issue number two is institutional investors are extremely perplexed on the data that is being available, that is published, or that is collected from issuers themselves, because two different sources providing data on the same issuer typically will show you different information. It could be that the definition was different. It could be that it was collected at a different point in time, many reasons, or it could be interpretation is different. But it's very perplexing for investors to see that the data may differ so much. So issues of both trust in the underlying data collected from issuers and applying different definitions are hurdles that need to be addressed. So it was just mentioned that we launched this ESG data analytics application, which is initially targeted at investors, asset owners, and asset managers, and is specifically reconciling any definition of sustainability, and is specifically addressing how investors trust or consider to be fit for purpose information collected from issuers. And we think that is going to help tremendously the investor community feeling confident in deploying capital in those new sustainable opportunities. So in terms of challenge, it's mostly trust and information and data manipulation challenge that we're currently helping institutional investors with.
Thank you, Colin. I think then we need to turn to Paloma to ask if there's any way to overcome that hurdles. I think it comes with are there any standards, principles, or benchmarks that can be recognized and having a practical application for the issuers to manage that concern? Paloma, are there anything on that front?
I mean, that's the issue, you know, it's in the sustainability segment, there's, I mean, it is cluttered with a variety of standard and taxonomies. So when looking at the specific areas of ESG, I think the International Capital Markets Association, ICMA, Green Social and Sustainability Bond Standards, have been widely used as a base. But at the end, each issuer, they develop their own framework. So like Irene is saying, there's not one specific kind of rule that everyone is following. They will take ICMA like as a base, but each company, each issuer will create their own internal framework. Even the European Union, just last year, they created the EU social bond framework, you know, as part of the EU short program that it was launched in October 2020. That it's an instrument used to help protect the jobs and keep people in the work because of the current pandemic. They developed their own framework. They used, you know, also. So every entity is kind of developing their own frameworks. For that, I mean, there are other regional standards, like, you know, Corinne was saying, China has also its own standard. Entities like, in countries like Malaysia or Singapore, Bangladesh, they all have their own frameworks, which it's very different to maybe what the European or ICMA, not very different, but their slightly priorities are different to the European or the ICMA standards. There are other countries which are in the process of developing their own frameworks, like Colombia, Canada, Australia, but they still haven't defined how they're gonna, you know, what is gonna be a priority for them, what is the design, the usage. But I think what the key issue here, you know, having so many standards, framework, it is the practical application. So how can we put in practice whatever is written, all these, you know, very long frameworks, how can we put it in practice? So digital technology is key. How can we translate into digital all these frameworks? And in fact, this is, you know, what we're currently doing. You know, Corinne is saying the demand from the investors out there. We see, what I hear from the issuers is that the investors are going to the investor relations department. They want transparency. Also, in the case of Europe, they need to comply with the new regulations. So how they're going to do it? How they're going to be able to compare all these different asymmetries from the different frameworks? So if we are successfully in doing this, you know, we will solve for all these bottlenecks that the industry is having, and, you know, again, try to avoid the greenwashing that we were talking about earlier. So transparency is key. The digital technology is something that we need to use, because at the end of the day, you know, investors will not be able to compare different investments that they have, because the frameworks, the base, it's a little bit different. And that's what we're hearing in the market. You know, we're talking to the issuers community, to the arrangers that are helping the issuers to create this framework. They're talking to us to see how we can assist them in digitizing all these concepts. Because, the ESG has come to stay. So now everyone is talking about it. We are developing all these tools, but we need to kind of sit down in practice, try to put it into data to be able to make better investment decisions and do appropriate reporting. So we'll see. There's no one taxonomy. There are many. I guess it depends also on the investors that you have. And, you know, Carmen can tell us about how different investors demand different things. So you need to look at your investor base and see what it is important for them. In the case of Europe, we hope, that's what the EU taxonomy has tried to do. Let's, for at least for Europe, let's try to do some standardization, because we had nothing. So the European Union is a top priority, the ESG agenda, and there was nothing kind of so much written. So I think with last year they said, okay, let's put more detailed information. And again, this is changing. If you go into the European Commission's website, there's a lot of information. You could stay reading all day, and they try, they want to provide transparency. So I would, encourage people to also go into the European Commission website, because there's a lot of information. They recently published, like, I'm not sure if it was April, May, a list of frequently asked questions, which I think will help to address some of the concerns that maybe the marketplace will have.
Thank you very much, Paloma. Now I would like to turn into the data part of the story, and Aish and Corinne responding together. What data are investors looking for really support sustainable investments, make sure all the taxonomy being left? What's your reading on that, Aish?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start then. We were talking about how very, very important it is to investors to make sure that their own set of priorities are being reflected in whatever investments. So it's important to have a good sense for what are the key priorities for the categories of investors that you are targeting. Historically, investors have been looking at sustainable investments more from an exclusionary point of view. So if you're in certain businesses, they're not going to touch it. And it's important to understand what are the most popular or common exclusions that are applied by investors. But increasingly, what we see across all of our surveys of investors is that they're focusing more on how integrated sustainability is within the practices of an issuers. And also, very importantly, they're starting to focus more and more on impact. And that's really important because we just mentioned a few minutes ago about the regulatory framework, and the SFDR regulatory framework in Europe is very much focused on impact. What impact do you have on issues that regulators have determined to be critical for their own agenda, especially on climate risk? And impact data is basically hard evidence, like how much did you reduce your water consumption for, or how much did you reduce your carbon emission by? So this is hard evidence that you would expect to be producing more and more. An interesting study that I saw actually published this morning by the climate disclosure standard boards was showing misalignment from many of the issuers on what they say they do versus what they actually do, especially around social issues, around human rights, about generally their impact on the general ecosystems, because there are many interactions between climate risk and social issues. So just know that these issues are at the forefront of the agenda for regulators. I also wanted to bring to your attention a number of decisions that were made by the Dutch national banks that is considered to be a leading thinker on sustainability regarding specific metrics, impact metrics that are expected to be produced by investors on various categories related to the United Nations and Sustainable Development Goals. So impact is going to be the next big area where investors are going to look for hard evidence, for instance, measurement from satellite pictures, Internet of. So this is the type of data that investors are looking for. To go back to what I was saying before, though, there has to be some evidence that this data is trustable. And so, for instance, we ask other investors to comment and to provide feedback through our applications on whether data is usable or not. So these are two aspects that I want to emphasize in terms of data that investors are specifically looking for.
Thank you. Aish, what you going to add on top?
And I'd like to start with something which Adriana mentioned, which really kind of like, stuck a record with me. Meaningful change, right? Meaningful change. What does that mean from a kind of like, from our role in the financial, as the intermediary, or like, as the role we play in the wider financial markets, right? How could we do that? And I want to focus on what I want to say about how we are trying to make that meaningful change from an issuer services perspective, right? Within issuer services, and I guess, Paloma, you mentioned it, that like, we are servicing 38 billion in green bond issuances, right? And that represents around 17 or 18% of the entire green bond issuances currently, right? So we have to take a very, very, given our role in the debt capital markets, we have to take a very, very proactive role to kind of to see how we could action that meaningful change. And what does that mean, right? And I'll go back to what Corinne mentioned as well, right? Retail investors from a US perspective, they are looking at self-labeling and those are real concerns for the investor community, right? So, and I want to bring it home here as well, from a European perspective, that and Paloma touched upon it as well, that that there are too many standards, even from an issuer perspective, there are too many standards. There's ICMA, there's European green bond standards, which is coming up along with taxonomies. There are other APAC and other regional standards which are coming up in the industry. So how could data and digital play a role so that we take a pragmatic view and we help our issuers to start their sustainability journey, to lower their green entry barrier or sustainability entry barrier, so to say, from a data and digital perspective, right? And that is our approach here. So I'll focus on European green bond standards for now, with regards to what we are with regards to how we are thinking that, when we are serving 17 or 18% of the global green bond or sustainability debt issuances, how could we help the 1.2 trillion outstanding in climate-aligned assets so that those issuers could start their sustainability journey, right? And that comes to we have to ask ourselves, what are the bottlenecks which the issuers are facing, right, at a data level? And many of these issuers are not big issuers. They are kind of SMEs, right? And when we ask ourselves that question, then we kind of realize that, green bond, when you compare it to the non-green bond, are kind of there's three elements which differentiate green at a conceptual level to non-green. And those elements are governance, traceability, and transparency, right? Now, how does that boil down into a digital and data framework? And again, I'll stick with the European green bond standards here, is the use of proceeds, which is again, what the issuer is promising on day one. They are abiding by those promises in the post-issuance stage as well. And that's the use of proceed aspect of it. Corinne touched upon the impact reporting of it, right? Impact reporting is quite, for small to medium-sized issuers, it's quite technical to kind of measure that. And that is an industry bottleneck. But how could we solve that as well, right? So that's the reporting aspect of this whole thing. And then, how do we kind of how do we bring the structure to the conceptual frameworks of governance, traceability, and transparency? And that's where digital and data can play a role. Also, again, when we are talking about these governance, three pillars of governance, traceability, and transparency, we have to look at it from the lens of European green bond standards or ICMA, because then the certain things change, right? Just to give a very, very kind of quick example here, impact reporting is mandatory under current, at least one in the life cycle of the security under European green bond standards, while it is kind of voluntary under ICMA green bond guidelines, right? So there's flexibility, and there is kind of a mandatory element to all this, right? So where we sit, like, from a corporate trust perspective, we are very pragmatic, like, we just want to help our clients and help our issuer clients to kind of start their sustainability journey and how digital and data could help that. And in that regard, we are building solutions which will help them in the pre-issuance stage to align to these frameworks, first of all, right, in a meaningful manner, in a streamlined and optimized manner. And in the post-issuance stage, we'll help them with regards to their sustainability obligations, which they need to abide by. And that is the use of proceed reporting and impact reporting. So TÜYİD, I'll stop here and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aish. Again, it was great perspective that you shared with us. I think we covered all the major things under the time frame that the panel had given us. Before closing and thanking to all your participation, I would like to pass the ground to Adriana again to connect all the things we covered from the beginning with the problems and the future prospect, and make a closing comment, putting BMI Malin in front. Adi, could you do this for us, please?
I will certainly try. And there was a lot of content in this conversation, so let me try to summarize. Yeah. As Paloma mentioned, ESG is here to stay. This is not, a one-off, something that's going to come and just kind of go anytime soon. Europe is on the forefront of the climate agenda, but this is expanding soon. And in other parts of the globe, there are other parts of the ESG agenda which are already more advanced. So we're going to have more of the conversation on all these topics. Data is the key element for the whole financial industry, investors, issuers, financial institutions, the whole lot. Transparency and trust are key. This can backfire very quickly. We've seen last Wednesday the Deliveroo example with a company going with an IPO, expecting to see great results in the UK, and they went down 30% in the first few minutes from the IPO itself, based on ESG concerns, both on the S and on the G, on the governance and treatment of the delivery riders. Definitely need for increased comparability. There is a lot of standards, a lot of different aspects. However, because of where we are right now, it's likely that we also need standards to be decided bottom up by the industry, leverage on technology and data. I will also go into one of the items that Corinne was mentioning about, the movement from exclusion to inclusion to impact. This is very, very relevant. And if anything, it will need even more of the data story that we were discussing before. New technologies major technologies, whatever we want to call emerging these days, are a critical component. And I'm thinking here about machine learning, artificial intelligence, potentially, distributed ledger. They're all key elements of a solution that's going to allow for better information provision, better insights to our customers, and better opportunities to follow, for example, how the proceeds of a issuance are being utilized. So we're going to see certainly more in the space, and central banks are keen to help that conversation and just kind of take this forward. We at BNY Mellon are very much on the forefront of these conversations, and because of who we are and what we do supporting the whole investment life cycle, we're exposed to every single element of the discussion on ESG. And aside of the fact that this is something that makes everyone on this call passionate about, I know, it's definitely something that as an organization, we need to be able to, to follow and be on the forefront. What we call future first is really what we believe is going to support and change the industry in the next few years. We would be delighted to continue the conversation with anyone who's interested. Cihat is certainly the first point of contact to reach out to, but delighted to continue the conversation. And for whoever wants to hear Mark Carney and some of these, interesting discussions we've had in a very recent event that we've organized, which is called Future First, please don't hesitate. There are some interesting insights there as well. But delighted for this opportunity to, be speaking about this subject.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana, Aish, Corinne, Paloma. Deep-hearted thanks and congratulations for all the comments you made. And again, I would like to close the session by thanking Turkish IR Society giving us this chance, and hope we can continue this conversation, which is long-lasting, long-standing. It won't be easy, but we won't have too much time as a global facts challenges. So thank you all. Thank you very much.